Good evening and welcome to the Monday, June 27th meeting for the Planning Commission and Commission for Citizen Involvement. Iris, would you please take the roll?
Buchanan.
Here. Here.
Heap is excused. Leak.
Here.
Pape.
Here.
Phillips.
Here.
Rigby.
Here.
Stewart.
Here.
Mans.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. I see that we have Councilor Jackie Mans to provide a council update.
Great. Thank you very much, commissioners. I hope everyone is well and staying cool. We had quite a packed meeting at our last council meeting on the 21st. I will give you quickly some of the highlights as I see that you have quite an agenda in front of you tonight. We spent time talking about adopting an IGA with Metro for housing or middle affordable housing on Boone's Ferry. We adopted that IGA and are moving forward on that. We also, that would be, let's see, I don't have the exact address, but it's where we currently have our staging area for the Boone's Ferry Road project. Apart from that, the other presentation that we had, a work session, was the climate friendly and equitable communities, which I believe that you're working on tonight, if I'm not mistaken. We had a very good work session on that and found out today, as I'm sure you have also from Director Siegel, that we're not liable to do some of the things that we discussed having to do if in fact we don't update our TSP. So that was good news. So I can't see everyone. I don't know why, might be my view, but at any event, if Director Siegel is there, thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know why you're blacked out, but it's okay. I'm going with the flow here. Our housing needs update and housing production. We had a work session on that, which we thought was, we had some debate and discussion on, and of course, where that is ongoing. Apart from that, I'm trying to see if there's anything else that would be of interest to the commissioners. That was it, other than the many proclamations that we had: Amateur Radio Day, Pride Month, and Gun Violence Reduction Awareness. So we, as I say, we had quite the packed agenda. Moving into next week, again, we have a packed agenda, the crux of which will probably be pickleball, which I don't think our commissioners will necessarily have anything to do with, and they should be thankful. So with that, I will go mute, and I thank you all for continuing to serve, and I'll be listening in. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Mans. Commissioners, any questions for Councilor Mans? Seeing none. Okay, thank you. We'll move on to number 4 on the agenda, the public comment. Iris, or is there anybody on who wish to speak? Topics not on the agenda. Number 5, Commission for Citizen Involvement, general updates. Were there any updates for citizen involvement? I believe we had. Okay. So we'll move on to item number 6, public hearing, the comprehensive plan, map, and sensitive land atlas amendments, LU 22-0015, with Paul Espy as a staff coordinator. No public comment or testimony will be accepted for the meeting today. And Iris, all other written testimony has been provided. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Pape. I was just waiting for Evan. I didn't know if he had anything to say. At the Planning Commission's June 13th, 2022 hearing on LU 2215, the Commission received oral testimony in support of the application from Ed Tromke with Jordan Rams PC, representing Jeff Parker, the prospective buyers of the properties at 13560, 13570, 13580 Goodall Road. The Commission also received oral testimony in support of the application from Ruchi Thalawanda, a neighbor residing at 13592 Goodall Road. Commission also received written testimony from the proponents or the prospective buyers, and it was entered into the record after the Planning Commission granted a continuance of the public hearing to this date, and it was limited to written testimony until June 20th, 2022, and no other testimony was received from the prospective buyer or representative other than what you have received already. The Commission also received written testimony in support of the proposed RP designation during the continuance period via a joint letter, Exhibit G 101, from Donna and Andrew Pedersen, 13590 Goodall Road, Ruchi Thalawanda and Jonathan Jesnick at 13592 Goodall Road, and Kelly and Ryan Robinson at 13594 Goodall Road. The residents of 13592 Goodall Road, Ruchi Thalawanda and Jonathan Jesnick included images of the water that flows onto their property after the land was disturbed immediately from behind the property. So I will just jump right in, and the Planning Commission had asked questions about the kind of the overall makeup of the sensitive lands overlay designations on the map, and I have figure 1.1 here in the supplemental report that shows RP and HBA designations on the development site and surrounding areas. The blue areas represent the resource protection, RP boundaries, and the green areas represent the habitat benefit, or HBA areas that were discussed in the report. The areas with the red hatching, they depict the RP resources that were previously delineated by the procedure provided in the Sensitive Lands Code for wetlands and then also stream corridors. And these generally occur during the actual land use review for these properties. It can either be a subdivision or a partition, and that provides a greater amount of focus and accuracy as to where those actual resources lie. And of course, it's only accurate to the point where the property boundaries are, allow for that study, because it generally can't go beyond that. But it is accurate where the property boundaries allow. Okay, so Mr. Parker contends that the proposed RP district map amendment is imposing an additional unmapped HBA district area on the subject properties, and that is not the case. Looking at staff on the page 1 and page 3, figures 1.1 and 1.2, staff finds that the reduction of the HBA district designation by this application does not result in a conflicting use or more of the Goal 5 resource area. Further, possible residential uses on the HBA district, areas are not a conflict with tree groves identified and designated for the HBA district protection, because the HBA development restrictions are voluntary. A property owner proposing a land division is not required to apply the HBA development restrictions unless the owner applies for an HBA, unless they apply for the HBA district incentives. Similarly, Mr. Parker appears to contend that the residential development is prohibited in the HBA district, which is also not correct. So the HBA is really not in conflict, and that's really not, would not be considered as a part of the ESE analysis. You have seen this before. This is the existing sensitive lands map, the existing RP and HBA designations for the existing creek, or Goodall or Niddle Creek. And this is what it will look like after the designation. Quickly, table 1.2 provides the areas covered by RP and HBA districts before and after the proposed map amendment on the two subject parcels. Take home for this is the table is that there's approximately 1 acre of designated RP overlay currently, or 19% of the 2 properties. And then this would make a total of 3 acres, or 58% of the 2 properties after the RP designation. The HBA is identified in the table to illustrate the actual reduction of the HBA when the additional RP is added. I won't go through all the details of the ESCE analysis. They are in the findings. I trust that you have gone over those. And although there may be some economic impacts upon the subject properties by protecting the wetland and riparian area through expanding the RP district, any negative consequences are substantially mitigated through the adjustments and density transfer allowed under the Sensitive Lands Code 500510 and the range of housing options allowed in the R15 zone. The substantial negative economic impacts envisioned by Mr. Parker is incorrect, is that it doesn't consider a full range of development adjustments in housing as previously stated. Staff also notes that there are substantial economic consequences for downstream property owners and public infrastructure if the flood dampening effects of the wetland and the riparian area are lessened through the removal of the RP zone and the associated disturbance that would happen after that. Additionally, the negative social and energy consequences Mr. Parker alleges are premised upon residential development without taking advantage of the development adjustments, as we previously said. As the ESE analysis demonstrated, these restrictions have positive social, environmental, and energy impacts and an uncertain marginal economic impact to the subject properties and community. Protection of these resources will allow residential development to occur while ensuring that residents continue to enjoy the positive environmental aspects of the resource. And I'm going to go ahead and end it there, and I'm open for any questions that you might have had about the written material or any of the other projects.
Thank you, Mr. Espy. Commissioners, or comments? Commissioner Stewart?
Hi, thanks for the presentation, and I'm going to ask a question that you may have answered last week, and I apologize I wasn't here. I did listen to the recording, though. The HBA areas, what qualifies? Like, how do you designate those? Like, what are the criteria for establishing an HBA area?
Excuse me, Chair. This is a quasi-judicial hearing procedure to add zoning to the property. Commissioner Stewart, if you didn't review the record and the testimony from last meeting, you would not be eligible to vote.
I did. I'm sorry.
Oh, I thought I didn't. But,
no,
okay.
I did.
Thank you so much.
And I was apologizing because if you had answered that question, I must have somehow missed it.
Okay,
but I don't believe I had heard anything on that.
Paul, I can briefly respond to Commissioner Stewart's question. So the way to activate that overlay to actually engage the incentives is by delineating the contiguous tree canopy or tree grove that HBA district represents, and then to identify a resource, what would be a habitat benefit protection area. So within that larger area, at least it's a percentage, I think it's 50% of the canopy, or it might be more than that. It's a percentage of the canopy has to be protected, just as if it were, a resource protection area. And so that's accomplished, through by setting aside in a separate tract, or putting an easement over it and basically applying conservation protection on it. It operates the same as what are called resource conservation overlay districts on public and private open space tracts. So, the city has resource conservation districts, resource protection districts, and HBAs. HBAs are akin to resource conservation districts when the applicant or the owner applies for that incentive and they protect it.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Leek?
Correct me if I'm outside the scope of asking this question. Was this designation arrived at due to someone applying for building on these properties? Or is this just something that happened in the process of identifying sensitive lands in Lake Oswego?
It's perhaps a little of both. They did apply for an annexation, and with their application materials, they provided an environmental report that documented the presence of the wetlands in the configuration that is shown in the map.
Thank you.
I got it. Okay, I'm sorry, can you hear me, or if I got feedback? Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, so, I was reading through all of this, and again, I'm not an expert on code, but let me just make sure I understand kind of what's happening here. Ms. Meyer is the owner of these two properties, and she applied for annexation because she's planning on selling it to Mr. Parker. That's the prospective buyer. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay, but the city is actually asking for amendments. I'm assuming that is so that it becomes legal, and then the city has access to the code when the development begins. Is that the reason the city is asking for this? Why is it not the owner asking for this?
It's unusual for the city to intervene in the designation of an RP resource.
Could you put?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
It's unusual to have the city designate an RP resource, and we've only done a few of them in quite a long time. So, but the reason this happened is because there was a wetland that was present, but there wasn't any comprehensive plan designation for that wetland. And so when we do see that, there are provisions in the code that require us or provide us with the option of designating those.
And if I may just add on to that. So when we annex property, we're required to apply zoning pursuant to the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan designates the resource protection district on the property along with the HPA. When we bring the property into the city, we apply that, and then through this analysis, determine that there is more to this RP district than just the stream corridor. There is in fact an associated wetland based on the data and the evidence that the applicant provided to the city. And so through the authority of the code, the city manager or staff may initiate this designation process to complete the environmental overlays that belong on the property as we annex it. So that's, I think, Mr. Espy said it's a combination of both, the property owner or the prospective buyer initiating the annexation and the zoning, and the city through this discovery of additional resources electing to apply the overlay districts that staff recommends that you.
I have one other question, if I may. Okay, so trying to simplify this so that I don't ask a bunch of dumb questions later on, okay? So the properties, could you go back to that first map that shows where the stream runs through it? Okay, so it doesn't show it on this one. And the other, there was one in the book that the stream runs right through that RP,
I can also show you this, which is the
kind of in that
aerial.
There it is, okay. So if this thing goes as it's proposed here and everybody agrees, the city council adopts it and the cities, how much of, and I don't need an exact amount, is it fair to say that along that drainage, the stream, that part's still going to be protected and there will be no development on that particular area? Is that correct? I'm sorry? Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm clear on that, okay?
Yes,
So the development would be in the white area and the light green area.
You could turn your mic on, just for recording purposes.
Possibly. The HBA area, they'd have to go through a process to mitigate the effects on that area.
No, actually, sorry, Commissioner Lake. The HPA area doesn't have any regulatory The HPA doesn't have any regulatory effect unless the future prospective developer elects to apply for incentives, designates the, identifies, delineates the tree grove, protects it, and then they can apply for basically adjustments to development standards in order to have a more tailored development plan. The area that I think you were asking about, the stream corridor, and the area that's shown in blue, that is a protected area. From the center line of the stream or the top of the bank, there is a dimension that is prescribed by code that has development must be set back. And there's very little, only really nominal encroachment is allowed into that area. There's also a construction setback beyond that that has to be protected during development. So that is the area that is required to be protected under our code. I had to correct.
Thank you, Director Siegel. Commissioners, are there any other questions for staff? Comments? Okay. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Deputy Attorney Boone, at this point, we close this portion down.
Correct, you may proceed to deliberation because you received
Deliberation.
any written comments. The purpose of your continuation was to receive written comments. You received those, so you may proceed to deliberation based upon the evidence that you have in the record.
Thank you. Commissioners, are there any questions regarding the written testimony that's been submitted?
I guess, excuse me, one other procedural. Commissioner Stewart, since you weren't at the prior meeting, which we declared ex parte contacts, financial conflict of interest and bias, do you have any?
None.
Thank you.
None and no context, et
Thank you.
cetera.
I'd like to note that I also was not present at that meeting. I've reviewed the memo, but I haven't reviewed the footage, so I imagine that I am not part of this.
Correct. You haven't reviewed the entire record, so you're not eligible to vote on quasi-judicial.
I see.
So with that being said, is there any questions or comments regarding the written testimony that's been submitted? Okay. With that, Commissioner, then it's up for discussion and deliberation. Any questions? Commissioner Leek?
I would just say that I think the city has done a really good job to outline an area that is sensitive and wildlife and flooding will happen. And I don't think the arguments put forth by the potential developer and the landowner pass muster, saying that we need housing is true. But if they were putting, cottage clusters in there, we might be talking something different, but that's really not where they're going with this. So I think this is well designed and should go forward as proposed by the city.
Thank you, Commissioner Leek. Commissioner Stewart?
I mean, what I'm looking at here is obviously a huge impact to these properties, but, aside from some other legislative process, there's, and knowing how we need to decide on whether the intent of the code is met here, there's, fortunately not a lot of leeway, I guess. So, having read and heard the recording, read the memos and the report from the attorney, et cetera, I don't see any flaw, I guess, in the reports. So I have no choice but to be in favor of it.
Thank you, Commissioner Stewart. Any other comments or questions? I would tend to agree with what Commissioner Leek just pointed out regarding the testimony that was provided in comparison or in contrary to the report that the City of Lake Oswego has put forward, it's very hard to get to a conclusion where that seems justifiable. So is there a motion that one would like to put forward, Commissioner Lee?
I guess I would like to make a motion that we vote on the comprehensive plan map and sensitive lands Atlas Amendment LU 22-0015.
Mr. Chair, I just want to, you have suggested findings, or suggested findings for adoption. It's, right, distributed in your packet?
I guess that's what we're trying to do.
Okay,
Right.
so it would be to move to approve and adopt the written findings that were presented by staff.
Okay,
Okay.
yes. Any seconds?
I'd like to second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Any abstain? Okay. Thank you. So with that, the motion carries. Mr. Espy, thank you very much for your time in putting that together. Now, moving on to number 7, work session, 7.1, housing needs and production strategies, House Bill 2003 work session. Number 1, reference PP 22-005. Public comments are accepted, and staff coordinator is Eric Olson.
Mr. Chair, just as an overview, this is, of course, is a work study session for you to provide direction to the staff, and while comments may be received, they are not part of the public hearing record. So if anybody wishes to testify upon the substance, they should come back for the public hearing. Okay? And the commission should not be engaged in deliberation on the ultimate question.
Wonderful. Thank you for the clarification.
All right, thank you, Interim Chair Pape. I'm here today to sort of follow up our recent efforts on House Bill 2001 with another related discussion surrounding housing policies, more or less. This is sort of a follow-up again to House Bill 2001, but it's more about the actual need for housing as opposed to zoning amendments and more of a study. So I will talk a little bit more about it, but we'll just begin by mentioning that this is, of course, pursuant to the City Council goal to conserve the community's quality of life by planning for growth and change, and to complete work on key housing initiatives, including House Bill 2003 compliance. So here's a brief overview of what I'll be going over today. I'll begin with some background on House Bill 2003 and just describe how it impacts how cities are required to plan for housing. I'll then I'll outline our proposed work plan to complete the work by the deadlines mandated by the state, and eventually ask some direction from the Commission for some direction on how to proceed. All right, so I'll do my best to keep this relatively broad. I know we've been delving into a lot of specifics lately regarding House Bill 2001 and middle housing, so this is kind of a new effort, and I just wanted to provide an overview really to begin. So, starting with the sort of concept of a housing needs analysis, this is something that the city already has adopted. It's something that we completed along with a comprehensive plan update back in 2013. And, that's something that we had taken a lot of look at. Originally this had, it serves a similar strategy now as to what it did back in 2012 and 2013 to include, an inventory of the supply of buildable lands and a determination of their capacity. It also requires that sort of cities conduct this analysis of existing and projected housing need by type and density range in order to determine the number of units and the amount of land needed for each housing type. Just so folks are sort of cursorily aware of what we had in that 2013 housing needs analysis in terms of findings, just a few sort of really big picture statistics, I guess, that came out of that work are that we forecasted that 2,300 units were needed to meet our forecasted growth in housing attainability levels by 2035. So it's a 20-year analysis back in 2013. We found that the greatest need in the city was for multifamily dwellings, about 37%, followed by single-family dwellings, but that was definitely the largest percentage of need. Of course, a lot of large vacant parcels in the areas maybe at that time that were zoned for multifamily, but not quite so much nowadays. A lot of those parcels have been built out, and so back in that original sort of analysis, there was a conclusion that I'm not sure will continue to stand, but a lot of the conclusion was that a lot of the city's projected housing need could be accommodated within these sort of town center areas where there were some vacant parcels for multifamily development. So just a bit of a broad overview as to where we were about 10 years ago in the analysis.
And I think we use the term vacant loosely.
Right, yeah, I guess
A lot of that
redevelopable.
property, a lot of that ground was developed and redeveloped, so. not a
Right,
lot
yeah,
of-
I mean, it was vacant or redevelopable,
Yeah.
I suppose, is the key caveat. But anyway, I think we're now, to a new stage of planning. Obviously, we have House Bill 2001 that's been adopted that will be effective in just a few weeks. And so, they, at the same time as House Bill 2001 was adopted, concurrently passed House Bill 2003 back in 2019. And as I mentioned, this is intended to help really address housing needs of the residents throughout the state. There's sort of three major pieces that were a part of House Bill 2003. The first one, and one that's kind of still ongoing that we are not completely clear on the implications of, is the regional housing needs analysis. That's something that the state is still sort of undergoing work on and developing some recommendations about this sort of larger statewide look at housing needs on a regional basis. But that is ongoing, so we will hear more about that once they've developed more guidance for us there. Of course, the second piece here is something I just touched on, the housing needs or housing capacity analysis. That's something that had existed previously, as I mentioned, but there is a new requirement under House Bill 2003 that cities update those every 6 years. So not only did House Bill 2003 sort of set a schedule and say, all right, all the cities need to update their housing needs analysis by this date. So for the City of Lake Oswego, that date is 2023. But they also set that sort of 6-year time frame for revisiting the housing capacity analysis. And of course, the biggest piece, I would say, and then probably the newest piece, really, the piece that we'll be dedicating most of our time to, is the housing production strategy. And that's really to promote the development of this needed housing that you identify with the housing needs analysis. This is a new requirement that is a part of House Bill 2003. And, it's kind of just to get cities to commit to addressing the needs that are identified in the housing needs or housing capacity analysis. So this is designed to promote the development of that needed housing and sort of establish timeframes and clear objectives for cities to do so. There was a rulemaking effort similar to what was undertaken for House Bill 2001 related to House Bill 2003. And so they adopted those relevant administrative rules back in November of 2020, just like House Bill 2001. So those kind of included a lot of information about what specifically must be included with a housing production strategy report, as well as sort of a criteria for compliance for cities that aren't able to follow through on those strategies or don't produce a housing production strategy. So House Bill 2003 impacts, much like House Bill 2001, all Oregon cities with over 10,000 residents. So you can see that on the map, and of course, you can see Lake Oswego within the metro area is affected. So we'll talk a little bit about a housing production strategy and what exactly this entails. This, as I mentioned before, is now required. It's actually required to be adopted 1 year after the housing capacity or housing needs analysis. I'll use those sort of interchangeably, but housing needs analysis is really the HNA is the core term I'll try to use. So we have a 2023 deadline for the housing needs analysis. Depending on when that's actually completed, it would be a year after that in 2024 when this would be due. So this is intended to evaluate, again, the progress and effectiveness of, well, first of all, you're obviously adopting the new housing production strategy. I also want to mention, though, that 3 years after you adopt a housing production strategy, there's another check-in. So there's a lot of check-ins here. So obviously, there's, every 6 years you have to have a housing needs analysis, and there's this midterm checkpoint every 3 years to sort of evaluate the success and sort of make tweaks to the housing production strategy as needed. So yeah, really asking cities to reflect upon which strategies were successful, which weren't, and to identify ways for cities to modify those strategies if something is not being addressed adequately. So as I mentioned before, this includes specific tools, actions, and policies that the city is going to commit to address housing needs outlined in the housing needs analysis. And that includes a timeline for adoption and implementation as well. So really trying to get cities to outline an actionable plan to address the needs that are identified. So when it comes to the housing production strategy report, there are 5 major components that are required to be included based on the sort of statute. The first is contextualized housing needs. So that's to essentially identify the relevant social and demographic trends, existing adopted measures that we're already pursuing in the city, market conditions, any existing barriers to housing, and the needs of, in particular, underrepresented populations in the city. Oh, excuse me. So the second piece there is engagement, of course, and that's something that will be a huge part of this. It will be it's actually required to be fairly robust by the state, but the idea is to conduct meaningful engagement with both consumers and producers of needed housing. So, when we're talking about consumers of needed housing, what we're talking about is sort of federally protected classes that are sort of protected under the Fair Housing Act, low-income populations, communities of color, people with disabilities, and other classes protected by the state and federal fair housing legislation. Another piece is strategies to meet future housing need. Of course, that's where you actually talk about the strategies you're proposing to meet the need, the timelines for adoption and implementation, and sort of a look at the breadth and depth of the potential impact on addressing housing need of that strategy. Of course, you'll have to analyze how the proposed strategies achieve equitable outcomes with respect to location and transportation, fair housing, housing choice, homelessness, opportunities for affordable housing, and gentrification or displacement as appropriate. And the conclusion is really just there for us to address any opportunities, constraints, or potential negative externalities associated with the adoption of the elements of the proposed strategies, and really to describe metrics that we will use to evaluate the progress of achieving these goals. So in terms of the review of a housing production strategy, there's several factors that the State Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD, is required to consider when they review a housing production strategy. So that includes unmet housing need in a particular area, the proportion of severely rent-burdened households in a given area, of course, recent development of housing and different policies that have been adopted, and they would also consider the HPS itself to a degree in that, and sort of what the city proposes to do within the document. They'll look at how the plans and the strategies respond to the needs of the homeless, including just those experiencing homelessness and how they're specifically addressed in Lake Oswego. They'll look at whether the strategies increase access to housing opportunity or eliminate barriers to housing or other relevant attributes that the DLCD deems to be relevant. So the state, through this rulemaking process, put together a working group, and they sort of created a giant list with different categories of housing production strategies that cities can choose from, so they don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel every time. They're not limited to only these strategies. There's always the option for cities to kind of come up with custom options, as you can see in that category Z. But this is just kind of to provide guidance to cities as they look at different strategies that might make sense. So you can see that there's different categories here. Zoning and code changes would be, obviously strategies that a jurisdiction could take to proactively encourage needed housing production, specifically through zoning and code modifications, or include regulations to ensure housing goals are met. There could be strategies to reduce regulatory impediments, of course, anything that's known to preclude providing needed housing within zoning, permitting, or our infrastructure improvement policies. Financial incentives, so a list of financial incentives that jurisdictions can use to give developers to encourage them to produce the housing we determine that we need. Financial resources, of course, for the same sort of issue, but looking at sort of programs and resources at the local, state, and federal level that might be able to contribute. Tax exemption and abatement, talked a bit about that in House Bill 2001, but that's something that is, of course, an option for cities to consider. Land acquisition, lease, and partnerships, so strategies that secure land for needed housing, unlock the value of land for housing, or create partnerships that sort of catalyze housing development. And, of course, there's a custom option category as well where the city can determine, sort of what strategies they think are most appropriate. If there's something that's not included in the whole list that cities, have to look at, then, there is some room for flexibility and for creativity here as well.
So Eric, I would just add or mention that, the city has some experience with almost all of these tools in one way or another. The ones that we haven't adopted or used are tax exemptions and abatements, and not sure what custom options are, but, zoning and code changes, the commission is, obviously, has had direct involvement in that. Reducing regulatory impediments, something that we do annually. We go through the code and look for unnecessary or outdated regulations, or just clarifying and streamlining the code. Financial incentives, the city adopted system development charge waivers and other fee waivers for eligible affordable housing development. So these are tools that, we have in place, and we have, really 3 projects that are in various stages of, pipeline that are all using those incentives or will be relying on those incentives to meet the capital stack, requirements for affordable housing. So, in land acquisition or land banking, the Boones Ferry Road site is an example of that. The city, chose to, put that property out there for housing. So I think the challenge here is, going to be coming up with the right, really what are the goals and what are the appropriate strategies, and then demonstrating to the state that we're making forward progress here. Because, we're not standing still. We're getting on, it's like we're getting onto a ship that's already moving. And I think one of the things that we want to do is demonstrate to the state that we are doing a number of these things. And it's not that we're starting from, zero. So that's it. And the Middle Housing Committee had made some recommendations as well that I think the commission and the council chose to hold off on, knowing that this work was coming, because it would be appropriate to consider some of those strategies.
Yeah, we've heard a lot, for a while now about, a need to look at this specifically within the city. What is the capacity of land that could be used for residential? What type of needs do we have when it comes to housing specifically for different demographics? So particularly in light of the recent adoption of code amendments for House Bill 2001, it really makes sense to look at the different strategies and the different tools we have in our toolbox, if you will, and how we can apply them to meet the needs in the sort of most considered way possible. So, nothing is really predetermined here, but there are many options, and there is a lot of process to kind of get us there. A lot of discussions to be had to make sure that we're kind of on the right track along the way. So I can pause here. I was going to get into the work plan next, but if there are any specific questions on the housing production strategy component or House Bill 2003, this might be a good time to address them.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Yeah, we do have a question. Commissioner Rigby?
Thank you very much for that overview. Just as a general question, the presence of a required housing production strategy seems to indicate that there would always be that the results of the housing needs analysis would always indicate that there is a need to produce more housing. In the future, is there a possible scenario where it would meet state requirements to say, we have the right amounts of the right kinds of housing?
I think in a lot of ways, the housing needs analysis was fairly loose. The process that had existed prior to House Bill 2003, there wasn't really much accountability or obviously the, cities have to reference, the findings of a housing needs analysis when they look at different, comprehensive plan amendments or zoning map changes or code changes, to sort of review those in light of that data. But, there hasn't been, I think a lot of those former housing needs analyses rather in many cities were designed such that they kind of just said, look, we're meeting the need. We think that it's here, and guess what? We're right on target. So I think the state is kind of saying, hey, like we have a statewide housing deficit, and they've identified a need for housing throughout the state. Looking a little bit more into accountability for that. But of course, there is a potential scenario where we say this is what we need. We know the population is increasing by X amount, and we just built a huge amount of housing in some part of the city. I don't see that necessarily happening, but of course it's possible. Based on what we know now, it's difficult to imagine that being the outcome, but it certainly would be a desirable outcome, and that's kind of the intent for us to get there.
And so in that scenario, DLCD would check off on a housing production strategy that says, maybe in the future, but we don't need to produce any right now.
Well, I think, just getting back to, so yes, I guess, first of all, yes, if you actually could prove in your data that you are meeting your housing need through your strategies, or are you saying that there wouldn't be any strategies required? Is that what you're kind of positing?
I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, I do think that in that case, there is a need for, cities to put a good faith effort forward to show they're making efforts to meet their housing needs. But the state isn't necessarily, they haven't indicated any desire to be punitive to cities. I think they'll work with cities that are providing that sort of good faith effort towards this housing production strategy. But, I think they certainly, it'll be more difficult to work with the state if we're not putting forward that good faith effort and just kind of not really proposing too much with this.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lee?
If that makes sense. I don't know, Scott, if you have anything to add.
Well,
to
just that, the ultimate, penalty beyond enforcement orders is that the state doesn't provide state shared revenue to the city. Gas taxes, cigarette tobacco, taxes, that's the hammer. But the reality is that I think what Eric's saying is correct, that, it's a collaborative effort really with the state now that we have these regional allocations that we're going to have to work with. I think, in terms of housing need or housing production, I think we have good evidence to show that we're producing volumes of housing. We're producing multifamily housing for seniors. We're producing multifamily housing for all ages at a fairly rapid clip. I think the challenge is showing that it's affordable for anyone earning less than 120% of the area median income. And that's where I think the state and the city need to get on the same page. And ultimately, I'll just editorialize a little bit. I think the state needs to put their money where the mouth is.
Same thing, right.
And, and help us build some housing. But that's another conversation. So,
Well, and it's actually a conversation that they're having actively with us. As of last week, DLCD was saying, we think that we're going to put out some financial resources. What do you guys think would be helpful? So it does seem likely based on what they're telling us, but who knows what form it will take.
Do you know how many housing, okay, so you had your analysis in 2013, and you said we need X amount of units. How much, do you have any idea of how many of those units have been satisfied?
Again, I think we've definitely not met that target, but we've produced a lot of multifamily housing. And so we've been able to sort of justify a lot of the decisions that we made to, look at multifamily developments and promote their development in town centers, pursuant to the sort of strategy, if you will, that was outlined in that former HNA document. So, we've been following through on it. It has been useful. And so it is useful to do these planning efforts. Not only, again, we have 5 new housing types that are now allowed throughout the city, and what can we do with that? What do we want to promote? What do we want to sort of try to steer that towards? It's always good to look at that, but of course, just things change. The population changes, market changes. There's a lot of different factors that obviously, if you think about the difference between today and 2012, there's a lot that has happened. So especially
Maybe
with
the state could step up and buy the Stafford Triangle and Then, partner with the three cities.
There are conversations about that. I'm not sure that there's much of an appetite for the state to expand the UGB of anywhere in particular, but I know that they'll get some pushback on that.
Hong Kong, here we come.
Yeah, just for the record, the three cities, Lake Oswego, Westland, and Tualatin, have an intergovernmental agreement with one another that it puts a freeze on expansion of the urban growth boundary until the three cities cooperatively, develop a plan for how we would go about planning that in coordination with one another. There's another agreement where the three cities and Clackamas County and Metro have agreed to, do the same. So, although there may be conversations across the state about expanding UGBs to meet housing needs in particular communities, this is not an area where there is no consensus or direction at this point to even look at that area. So I just want to be clear about that.
Thank you, Director Siegel. That was actually going to be part of a comment that I was going to make, or a question I was going to make, as we get to the point where what Mr. Olson was referring to earlier, and that's the developable or the bare land. There's not much there, but there is developable land or redevelopment, right? Once we start maximizing that, and we don't have that, or that percentage significantly dwindles down, the bare land available, how is the state and or the Metro going to work with City of Lake Oswego to allow more land so that we can actually identify places where we can build to meet the state's needs and requirements?
You want to? Yeah, so the regional population and employment forecasts that are developed by Metro with the cities and counties are those are the inputs for the land need analysis that Metro does on I think it's a 5 or 6 year cycle. And, historically the finding, they've come to the conclusion that, we have enough land, we've had enough land for housing in this part of the county. The most recently, the Metro expanded the UGB out into the Damascus area. And that was a complete fail. There was no governance, there was no infrastructure, and the housing need was not met out there. So as a result, they went out to other areas. They went to the, Tigard and Beaverton and Hillsborough, and have, absorbed a lot of housing, meeting the regional need out in those parts of the metro area. We haven't touched this part of the metro area for, land need, but if we come to the conclusion that, we don't have sufficient buildable, vacant, and redevelopable land within our boundary, and Westland doesn't have sufficient land, and the other neighboring cities are out of land, then there's going to be a conversation about where to go next. We just haven't arrived there yet, and I think the housing needs analysis will tell us how well positioned we are to continue infilling and growing with our existing boundary. That's really going to be the key issue, I think. That
yeah, and I guess I would just reiterate, the last time we took a look at this, we did find that there was enough land within Lake Oswego to serve the need. So it would be a change. We don't know that there won't be enough land quite. So.
Okay, thank you. Continue, please. Thank you.
All right, and so I'll just move on to the last sort of portion of the presentation here, just talking about our proposed work plan to get through both of these sort of components, the housing needs analysis and the housing production strategy. So this is just a draft project schedule. Not going to go through everything here, but just the idea is to put out an RFP about mid-August and get a consultant on board by mid-October, and to bring them on board and start doing some work on the housing needs analysis, some outreach and research pretty early on to reach an adoption before the end of next year as required by DLCD, and then to, of course, not necessarily wait till that's done, because we don't necessarily have to have a final report to get going on the sort of housing production strategies and thinking about what those could look like, but to basically get started on that as soon as we can afterwards and aim to adopt that potentially less than a year after the housing needs analysis, but we'll see how it goes. Roughly 1 year after, let's say. But yeah, ideally it would be closer to 6 months. In terms of the draft scope of work that we're talking about, you know, the kickoff for the project obviously be about October of this year, and a lot of that sort of engagement would really start at that point. Another thing that we're envisioning is for a ad hoc advisory committee to be a part of this sort of initial sort of outreach component. So that's something that I will talk to you about in just a moment. But a lot of this early work would be, you know, to really just kind of think about, you know, obviously we'll think about who to engage over the course of the next few months, but how to really increase that turnout and really focus on the populations that we're required to focus on, you know, those underrepresented populations in the city that we have a hard time reaching out to sometimes. So really thinking about creative strategies to do that. The next piece would be obviously to start building the building blocks for the housing needs analysis, do the sort of comprehensive quantitative analysis that we need to get that together. Again, that would be, in order to get adopted before the end of next year, something we'd want to have a draft of by about September of next year to come to hearings of the Planning Commission and City Council, you know, fall and sort of late in the year next year. And so right after that, as I mentioned, we pick up work on the housing production strategy and start talking about those different alternatives and what makes the most sense based on those initial findings. So yeah, that basically covers it in terms of next steps. You know, as I mentioned, really our current, the next, you know, big deadline here would be to issue that RFP on the 15th to get a consultant to help out with this research, and also to appoint an ad hoc advisory committee for the fall. And again, we're looking at not just this sort of housing consumer piece, but you know, looking obviously at representatives of city boards and commissions, which is typical for this type of committee, builders that are familiar with different types of housing development that are common in Lake Oswego, and again, consumers of housing, you know, that we are required to reach out to, but it's also something that I think would be obviously a huge benefit for us to get a lot of information from these hard to contact, you know, populations and try to get some help doing that. So yeah, we're hoping to really get started by about October this year. So really soon after House Bill 2001, really trying to pick up and not waste any time here, keep the momentum going. But that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much. That seems like a great strategy and a great process to follow. And a lot of work following on the heels of what has been a lot of work with the two House bills. So thank you very much. Commissioners, any comments or questions? No? Okay. So at this point, are you looking for a thumbs up or thumbs down on the presentation and the process that you'd like to go forward with, or?
Yeah, just, you know, if you have any, you know, if you roughly approve of the work plan, that would be good to know. If you have any advice or direction for me, that'd be great to hear.
Okay. Well, I think we can allow the commissioners to chime in. Commissioner Leek?
But will you possibly be using the same planning people who did HB 2001?
Well, it's of course possible that we'll be issuing an RFP and going through the solicitation that's required of the city. But, you know, they could be likely to apply.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments? Okay. I think it would be reasonable to say that, yeah, thumbs up. I think it's a great outline, a good process and strategy to follow. And I definitely would agree having that ad hoc committee, especially with the workload that's going to be more likely coming down the pipeline for the Planning Commission, to have another body provide them with a high-level overview as what you're suggesting. Would that be the same for the City Council too?
Yeah.
That committee would then report to both, basically?
Yeah, similar to the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee, where we had one committee that sort of provided guidance to the Planning Commission to advise City Council, I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
With that, we can move on to other business. Director Siegel reporting on the climate-friendly and equitable communities, PP 22-0001. Public comments are accepted, but I think we're going to continue on.
Thank you, Acting Chair Pape and Commissioners. I did present to the City Council on this last week, and This was really being billed as an update rather than a work session, because there's a lot of new, this is a lot of new information, and for staff included. And there's still a lot of moving parts and a lot of questions that we still have for the state about what all of this entails. But just by way of background, and I'll just wait until the slides are up. Just by way of background, the governor issued an executive order in 2020 that was aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and I think modeled after what a number of other states have been, trying to achieve, particularly the state of California. Looking at it in a really intelligent way, actually, in a multidisciplinary, multi-agency, kind of high-level and low-level way at looking at climate change or greenhouse gas emissions. And so the executive order, just to kind of distill it down into kind of the essence of it, was to direct a myriad of state agencies to look both inward, to look at their sort of internal operations, whether it's their vehicle fleet or how they, telecommute or just energy use generally. But also to have those agencies look at their kind of their policy framework, whether it's the Department of Transportation promulgating rules for transportation planning, or the state planning agency, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, was directed, and this is mostly what we're going to be talking about tonight. DLCD was directed through this executive order to look at ways of reducing greenhouse gas emission through land use policy, land use and transportation planning primarily. Other agencies, were sort of directed to go forward. The Department of Energy, Building Codes Division, a number of others. I can't even remember all of them, but they're all sort of set out to go kind of best practices, look at policy reform or innovation to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, both within the state government and also just out in our communities. So that's really kind of the high level, where this was coming from. It's an executive order. This was not legislation. The legislature had attempted, or at least I think the Democratic caucus had attempted over one or two sessions to try to, put forward a package of climate action bills, and they were not able to move that forward. So the governor, I think, took action of her own accord and set all of this in motion. In the last year, the Department of Land Conservation and Development promulgated rules. They had a rulemaking advisory committee, and it was on a fairly fast track, faster than most of us would have liked, to be honest with you. Local governments, both elected officials and practitioners around the state, were really, generally, our city and others are, favorable on the policy intent of what we're trying to do here. Kind of the execution of this, it was really too fast. It was without really due consultation, and as a result, some of the rules that came out of the process are very difficult, one, to understand, two, to actually implement, and there's some administrative difficulties as well as just budgetary impacts that we don't think, and I think I can speak for the city manager and the council because they've discussed this, that there really wasn't adequate vetting. But such as it is, we have a set of rules now, and we're we're charged with moving forward and implementing the rules, complying with the state requirements. And so what I'd like to do is just provide an update on what the content is generally, and then also let you know where the council's at on this, just to go right to that point. The council felt that the key changes, the policy changes that we're being asked to make here could be deferred, and those are relating to parking primarily. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And then some of the other changes that are directed through the rules are changes that will go into effect and will be implemented really by automatically or by default. They don't necessarily require action on the part of the city. So we'll talk about those two things. There's a sort of a bucket of policy and code changes that we will need to approach and make some decisions around. And then there are other actions that will be, that'll just be implemented automatically as a result of the rules. So again, the goal is, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by the year 2035 and by 50% at 2050. And the rules that we're covering here this evening are really directed at patterns of development that minimize really the need for private vehicles or single occupant vehicles. I think that's probably the easiest way to describe it. So development in compact mixed-use centers. Our downtown is a town center that's relatively walkable, although transit service is not plentiful. It does have the capacity. We do have the basic, skeleton of the transit system, and in the future, provided TriMet has the resources and things fall into place, we do have the potential for good transit service here. So directing development into these areas that have the potential for that are walkable, where alternate modes of transportation are feasible, and provide people with access to services and the ability to get from place to place or to meet daily needs within walking distance. So that's kind of the crux of this. The rules and the greenhouse gas emission goals are geared toward really maximizing that opportunity through efficient transportation, because transportation accounts for about 38% of energy use or greenhouse gas emissions. And that's the area where we can really move the needle. Collectively, local governments and the state can move the needle with land use policy. Some of the other areas where you see energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, electricity is a huge one, heating and cooling buildings, industrial uses, burning coal or natural gas to generate power for power plants, industrial and agricultural uses. But really, transportation is the key sector that we're being asked to move the needle, and energy as well. So the first area the first set of rules deal with EV charging capacity. And so this change is effective as of March 31st, 2023. The building code now requires, or will then require, that for all multifamily and mixed-use buildings that have at least, I think, 5 residential units in them, that 40% or more of the parking spaces for those buildings or those uses will have electrical EV charging capacity or capability, which really means that we have the power service, we have the electrical service, we have the space in the building or in the parking structure, and we have conduit, but it's not requiring necessarily that the chargers are there. And I think that's really just trying to provide the opportunity more than anything. 40% it's ambitious. I think I read someplace that was it 8 or 9% of vehicles in Oregon are EV or hybrid charging. So 40% is obviously quite a bit more than that, but the goal isn't just to try to meet the needs for today, but to plan for the future and to provide that opportunity. So this will be administered through the building department. We receive building permits and plans. This is one more thing that we'll be reviewing with those plans and working with applicants. This is the language. I think there's also authorization in the rules for cities to go above and beyond this, or to require through local building code adoption additional charging, more capacity, or more capability, or capability for other types of uses, like commercial uses. This will go into effect automatically, and it doesn't require any policy or code work by the city. transportation system plan update. Councilor Mann spoke earlier today. She had mentioned that there were some elements of what we were reading in the rules and what were presented to council last Tuesday that we thought were required on the part of the city, but are in fact not required. And this is one of those. For cities outside the Portland metro area that are subject to the rules and the other 7 metro areas around the state, those cities are required to update their transportation system plans and to comply with the set of rules. Because we're in the Portland metro area, one of the things that we were able to achieve, thankfully, through our brief but effective consultation with the state and metro was to really have all of the jurisdictions within the metro area fall under the umbrella of Metro, as Metro is updating the regional transportation plan. Any action or direction that comes from that regional plan to local governments like ours would suffice. That if Metro Regional Transportation Plan directs certain updates to our transportation plan, perhaps not a wholesale revision to it, but certain amendments we might be asked to make, that would suffice for meeting the state's climate-friendly and equitable community rules. The same principle applies for some of the other policy work that initially we thought we were going to have to do and other parts of the state are required to do, but we're not because we're in Metro. There are certain zoning amendments that other regions are now required to make in their downtowns or their town centers in their mixed-use districts. For example, increasing building height. We're not required to do that. We certainly could look at that if that was something that the community wanted to explore as a way to promote more efficient development or greater potential for transit, but we're not required to do that. So that was something that I had reported to the council on last week. I said, I think we might be required to increase building height to 60 feet, which is what the rules say for other communities in the Lake Grove Village Center, for example. In the downtown, we're already at 60 feet. But checking in with the state last week, and we were on a webinar, folks like myself from across the state, and we asked this question because the rules were unclear, and they said, no, it's only for jurisdictions outside the metro area. So no update to our transportation plan unless the council and transportation advisory board and commission, under Metro's transportation plan determine that we need to do that. Really the main area of focus or inquiry here is relating to parking. And the state in the rulemaking process, they really went to great extent to I think what they were trying to do is look at parking reform as a way to drive some of the land use patterns that are envisioned through this executive order and the rules. In other words, if we develop with less parking, I think the theory is that, or if we give applicants, developers, and property owners the choice to really set what they believe is the correct amount of parking for their use or their development and not over-prescribe parking or not require parking as we currently do in our code that may or may not be the right fit for a particular development, that will lead to more efficient development, less surface parking, more walkable town centers, greater potential for transit. Now that's kind of the theory. On the one hand, I understand, there's sort of two schools of thought with parking. One comes out of the suburban, sort of the model that was developed post-World War II when the federal highway system was developed and community suburbanization, took hold. And there was a need for vast amounts of parking. People were driving, and they were not driving to downtowns or any place that had any kind of public parking. They were driving to shopping centers that only have certain, off-street parking. They were driving to remote areas that did not have any transit service. And so that model, proliferated And, communities all across the country, including ours, adopted parking codes that, emulated or adapted that parking model. So we have a set of requirements in our code that is really just a table that has a list of uses or types of business on one column, and minimum parking requirements in another column. And then we have a number of modifiers that sort of adjust for different things in our downtown and elsewhere. But it's really a very prescriptive model. And we know, from experience that, one size doesn't fit all. And so there's an alternative track. And if you're a business owner and you believe that your business model would require less parking than what our code prescribes, then you can produce a study or some analysis that demonstrates, why that is so. And then our parking code is adjusted accordingly, or the standard is set based on that site-specific, use-specific study. So, we have this sort of suburban model of parking requirements along with some modifiers that we've adopted over time. I think a recognition that, if we were to build out our city based on the suburban model, you wouldn't have a walkable downtown. You'd have buildings that were several hundred feet apart from one another, separated by parking. So we have a hybrid model, the suburban model with some of these other adjustments and the option for a parking study. But the state...
Can I ask you a quick question since we're kind of on the subject?
Sure.
Doesn't, I'm trying to remember, wasn't it Westlake Grove or one of those areas where you can actually use like a parking study as an option for developing parking? I seem to remember that.
Yeah, that's right, Commissioner Stewart. So that option exists citywide, that you can opt for the parking study. The problem with it, though, is that it's a minor development application, which means it's a land use decision, and so there's a pre-application conference that's required. There's a fairly hefty fee because of the staff time that's required to review that. It's open for public comment. It can be appealed to the Development Review Commission. It can go beyond that to the City Council, and so it's not the most streamlined way to try to set correct amount of parking, but it is what we have. So that's one model. And then the state, really the intent here is to try to really, there's been a shift, and there's really two schools of thought about parking across the country, that a more market-based approach where you allow, the end user or the applicant to set the correct amount of parking for their use. And business knows better than government about how to operate a business. And I can kind of understand and appreciate that. On the other hand, if you're in an area that doesn't have any public parking or any on-street parking, and someone chooses to set their parking low enough that some of the visitors, the customers and the employees will, before they'll park elsewhere, they're going to park in the neighborhood. And that's the externality. That's the issue that we have to be thoughtful about. So anyway, that's the background. That's the thought process from the state. Kind of the approach that we're being asked to look at, or actually to adopt in some form. And one of the difficulties that we have with this. So parking policies and codes fall into, and I had to create this awful chart to try to understand it, because it's really complicated what we're being required to do. I think the easiest way to think of this is there are three buckets of policy and code work that we're required to do. In the first bucket, Phase A, is due by the end of this year, and in fact, if we do nothing, it goes into effect anyway, and the state rules apply, or we'll have to apply the state rules directly. And Phase A changes our parking code from one that has sort of a graduated scale of parking requirements for housing to one where only one parking space is required per housing unit, period, whether it's a multifamily building or a single-family home or middle housing, one space per housing unit, so a duplex, 2 parking spaces. And we've already done this with our middle housing code. But we haven't done this for any housing above that. So for a 5-unit or larger multifamily building, this would be a change, because currently our parking code requires, I think it's 1.25 spaces for a 2-bedroom unit apartment and 1.5 spaces for anything larger than that. So, you know, we will be requiring 1 space per unit for all residential developments with more than 1 housing unit. And then secondly, there will be no parking required for housing that is smaller than 750 square feet of floor area. So, you know, that could be a studio or, you know, an efficient 1-bedroom apartment. Nor will there be any parking required for childcare uses or for facilities for people with disabilities or shelters or affordable housing developments. And so that's not to say that these developments won't provide parking. I think in most cases they will. They just will not be required by the city to provide off-street parking. Now, the biggest kind of move here that the state's required in Phase A, again, goes into effect at the end of this year, is that there's no parking required within 1/2 mile of what are called frequent transit corridors. And these are, we have 2 bus lines that under the state rules, the definitions would be considered frequent transit routes, although they're probably not what you and I would think of as frequent. 1 hour headway, so 1 hour scheduling or better meets the definition of frequent transit corridors. And we have 2 bus lines, line 35, which runs north and south along State Street, Highway 43, comes into the downtown, stops right across the street over here at the transit center, and then goes on up to Portland. The other line is 78, and that line actually begins at our transit center, and it runs out along A Avenue Country Club, up Kerr Parkway, through Mountain Park up to Portland Community College, and then takes a circuitous route out to Tigard. So those are the frequent transit corridors, and literally no parking mandate for any use or development within a 1/2 mile of those lines. So, I mean, you can see on the map there, a lot of that is residential and, you know, largely built out. But, you know, it encompasses our entire downtown and commercial area to the south. It does not include the Lake Grove Business District or the town centers, you can see, which is a little sort of a paradox. It's like, well, we thought you were talking about areas where, you know, we're trying to promote compact, walkable development, mixed-use development. So that's, well, we can put, the city, we can put a parking garage wherever we can afford to put a parking garage and where the property owners are amenable and, you know, want to put a parking garage, but we cannot require, you know, development to put a parking garage or any parking for that matter. Okay, so I'll go back. Why is this going forward? Okay. So I know that's kind of a mouthful, and it's, you know, groundbreaking. So are there any questions about this? I think the biggest takeaway that I got from talking with the city council about this was that, you know, we need to communicate. We need to have, you know, this information out in the community so that people understand what it is that we're required to do, and, you know, and what options exist for property owners.
Commissioners, any questions? Oh, Commissioner Buchanan.
I think that in the future, you know, people are going to be using apps on their phone to call Uber, Lyft, etc. There's going to be self-driving cars and a lot less need for parking. I know a lot of teenagers these days don't get their license and they just don't care about having a car. And I think probably 8 to 10 years from now, we're just not going to need as much parking.
Yeah, I know a lot of planners and futurists and others who think about this, like myself, agree with that. The question is like, when and, to what degree, and anyone knows. But I think, policies like this are intended to, help drive that. They can't drive it by itself. But that's, other, okay. This is a minimum requirement, so it's not something we really have any span of control over.
Quick question, Director Siegel. I'm fascinated with point 2, and maybe I'm not understanding it correctly, but no mandates for small units, affordable units, childcare, facilities for people with disabilities. Does that mean the ADA parking spaces, the current requirement, is that now going away?
No, that's a good point, because and that's an example of where we were all scratching our heads as this was being put together and saying, well, this doesn't preempt the ADA. No, it does not preempt the ADA. What I think it means is that beyond those required accessible spaces, there is no other parking required by the local jurisdiction.
Okay.
But what's problematic with that, though, is that the ADA space, the number of spaces are based on the number of spaces in the lot or on the property. So how do you calculate ADA space? I don't know the answer to that. I honestly don't know how we're supposed to administer that, but we'll find out. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so then the second bucket, and I'll just go back to this real quickly. Right, so then the second bucket, Phase B, this is where we have a choice. And the city could, the commission could recommend, the city council could adopt an ordinance repealing all minimum parking mandates, and then we would be done with this chart. Or alternatively, and that's option 1, or alternatively, we can look to options 2 and 3. And 2, I'm sorry, I didn't cover B, did I? So before we get to B, before we get to choosing whether or not we repeal all parking requirements, we have Phase B, which is due by the end of the year, or excuse me, by June 2023. You can tell I need to practice this. And B has a list of these changes that are called parking improvements. So it's not changing the number of spaces, but it's kind of qualitatively we're making improvements or changes that facilitate more climate-friendly and equitable solutions. So carpool and van pool spaces required and provided in proximity to building entrances. So, we see this. We actually have carpool spaces in the lower parking lot at City Hall that are located right, closest, along with the ADA spaces closest to the entrance. And so this is something that would be required in the second phase of this work. Second, it's looking to allow really redevelopment or reuse of parking lots for other, higher uses that would be more climate friendly, like bike facilities, bike racks, transit stations, and redevelopment of underutilized parking lots for other uses. So, again, I don't know how that will be interpreted or how we're expected to define that. What constitutes underutilized parking? Is it a parking lot that, do we have to do parking counts? We don't know. But we believe the intent is to allow for reuse of those parking lots and to not preclude that with parking standards, I suppose. The items that are italicized here allow and facilitate shared parking and establish parking maximums. Those are 2 policies that we currently have in place. We do have maximum parking, although if we have maximum parking is based on the minimum ratio. So if the minimum is X, maximum is X times 1.2 or 20% over the minimum is the maximum. So if we no longer have minimum parking requirements, how do we determine the maximum? Okay. We do allow and facilitate shared parking. So that's something that we currently have available. If two businesses get together and they say, hey, you're a bank, and, you know, I'm a movie theater, or, you know, you're a church, and I'm something that doesn't operate on Sundays, or, you know, those two uses can share parking spaces, and adopt any, you know, reciprocal easement, shared use agreement, and we will honor that. It has to go through a land use process for approval, but it's available. And then finally, Phase B, again, due by June 30th, 2023, requires that it's basically a landscaping requirement that we have at least 50% tree canopy over all surface parking lots, or alternatively, the development can meet that with solar panels. So, you know, again, it's getting at climate solutions. So tree canopy reduces the heat island effect. You know, it reduces energy consumption for for cooling buildings. Generally, that's the benefit. You know, as well as just providing a more comfortable environment for you and I. Solar panels, you know, renewable energy, that's kind of taking care of the energy sector on that chart we were looking at earlier. Yeah, that's a lot, I know. That's the second bucket, and that is also a requirement.
This was an executive order, not a legislative.
That's right, the executive order.
Could a new executive roll some of this back?
Yeah, I believe so. An executive order would have to direct those agencies that, you know, adopted, the commissions that adopted all of these rules, I think, to begin a process of undoing them, if that were the direction from the governor, I think. Yeah, unless the legislature adopts, you know, statute. If it becomes law through the legislature, then I think that's a different question. Okay.
Would there be, regarding the tree canopy, would there be any type of provision when the next ice storm comes in and takes the limbs down, that the state then replants the trees, or is that going to be on the city?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good
It
question.
could be a rhetorical question.
You know, 48%. Yeah. To get back to your question earlier, Commissioner, about the percentage, I'll need to go back and look at the language, because it may be that it's not 50%, because I seem to remember seeing some power generation figure, and it would make more sense actually to have that be the metric for, you know, meeting the standard than you know, actual coverage. I think I remember seeing that, but so don't quote me on it, and don't quote me on the 50% solar panels either.
Well, a lot of these things that we're talking about is interesting, because the state of California and a lot of jurisdictions already has these things in place, like the 50% tree canopy. You pretty much have to do that anywhere. And I believe their current code requires solar panels on all commercial buildings. So I mean, this is just something that I think the state of Oregon is going to kind of follow eventually, and they're already, looks like, starting to do that.
So are these solar panels in the parking lot or on the building?
These are in the parking lot, I believe.
And so then they'd also have to be tied into the grid too.
And you know, Commissioner Stewart, your comment about, you know, canopy, our community has 50% tree canopy cover overall. Now that includes, you know, open spaces, but it also includes our commercial and you know, commercial development. So 50% is a number that we're familiar with. Okay, that's A and B. And then we move into the options. So option 1 is repealing all remaining parking mandates by June 30th, 2023. Or alternatively, option 2, we would adopt 3 out of 5 of these policies. And this was actually the option that the council seemed to be more interested in than as compared to options 1 or 3. But again, you know, they have not, nor have we really studied this in a lot of detail. Unbundling, so the first 2 options here talk about unbundling parking. And what that means is that it would be a locally adopted code requirement that says, for these uses, residential in A or commercial in B, that the owner must, if they're leasing space, then they're required to lease the building space separately, or the parking spaces separately from the building space. Meaning, and kind of the theory, the thought process on that is that if let's take an apartment complex as an example. If I'm a resident and I don't own a car, never wanted a car, never will have a car, I get around in other ways. I take transit or I walk. Why should I have to pay a rent or a price that is essentially subsidizing everyone else who has free parking essentially? And so it's really an equity play, and I totally understand it. So that's really the goal, is decoupling the parking from the building space that one is leasing. I think where it becomes problematic is it's more of an administrative problem. Like, how do we enforce that? What are we doing? Do we need to have staff who are, auditing this? It's problematic. I mean, I'd prefer to see this. I'd prefer to see this actually, in state rules or DEQ, some state rule that, like the commute trip reduction requirements that DEQ administers. There's an annual report that employers with, I think, over 50 or more employees are required to report to DEQ annually on what they're doing to reduce, single occupant vehicles. But that's not what this is doing. This is requiring the city to adopt regulations that, if we were to choose these options, we would have to adopt code to require that decoupling of parking. The other options here, C, it is actually one of those commute trip reduction strategies where employers provide, in this example, a transit subsidy or a free transit pass to their employees. And so this wouldn't be limited to the city government, which this is something that we already do for the workforce here. This would be for all employers with 50 or more employees in the city, if we were to choose this option. And then D is a tax on revenue from commercial parking lots, of which we have none that I know of. City has no commercial parking lots that I know of that are public, right? I mean, they're certainly, probably office buildings in town where the spaces are, leased or they're decoupled. But this would be a tax on revenue from commercial parking lots, pay to park. So, if we were to choose that option, we would put that in our code, we would put it on the books, and then at some point in the future, when we get to this place where, there is a market for commercial parking facilities, then there would be a tax on it. And then finally, the last of the 5 options we have to choose from is reducing our parking requirements for multifamily even further, even beyond the 1 space. We would reduce it to 1/2 space. All of those elements, we would choose 3 out of 5 of those elements. And in addition to that, parking is repealed within a 1/4 mile of our 2 town centers, which are the downtown and the Lake Row Village Center. It means that there's no minimum parking required. So if I'm moving my business into a space and, it's going from, retail to restaurant, and today the parking code would say, oh, well, it looks like you need to provide, whatever the ratio is for restaurants, it might be 10 spaces, whereas for retail, it might only require 2 spaces or 3. So repealing means that goes away.
Question, Scott. I have a question. So do I understand that correctly? Option 2, no parking within 1/4 mile of the city. I'll just use this building as an example. Does that mean that parking lot goes away out there?
No, it just, Commissioner Phillips, it means that for any new development or any change in use, like what I was just describing, the city would not require the owner or the developer to provide additional parking or to provide any parking.
Okay.
If they have parking, all of the existing parking it's all allowed, it's all permitted use. It's just that the city wouldn't be requiring additional parking. So that's option 2, pick 3 of 5.
Director
and-
Siegel, we have-
Yeah, yeah.
Take another question from Commissioner Buchanan.
The parking that is subterranean to the west of us here, or the east of us here, how did that come to be that it's free parking?
In the Windward block, the mixed-use block just next door.
Yeah.
Yeah, it came, okay, so in the Windward development and in Lakeview Village, which is across First Street, there's public parking. Actually, the parking garage in Lakeview Village is a public facility. Those two projects, I mean, the public parking came about in different ways. So Lakeview Village was part of a redevelopment project where the city, had made the land available, and as part of the development agreement, that parking garage was developed, and that was the public benefit that was derived, through the redevelopment process. On the block that is just adjacent to us, that is a private development. It's all private. The garage is a private space, and there are, I think, 130 or 140 spaces within that garage where the city has essentially an easement for the public, in order for the public to use those spaces. And they're also used for, the retail, for the businesses in the development. But and that was agreed upon between the city and the developer, again, through the redevelopment process. And the public benefit was that we would have this, parking that's in a space that's hidden away, and that, allows for this pattern of, walkable downtown development that we have. So, that's perhaps, an old model of redevelopment where parking is, really kind of the goal or the outcome. But it's, it's something that we've continued to pursue, as like with the North Anchor. There'll be some spaces in that development that are open to the public, and it's, that's been our strategy for redevelopment, so that we are able to have this walkable downtown, and we're not requiring, surface parking, for example. As parking spaces and garages are expensive. It's like tens of thousands of dollars to create one space in a garage. So, that's perhaps another reason that the state is trying to get us to, make our parking requirement, either make them go away or make them leaner than they are now.
Can you talk a little bit more about the benefits that the developers had by providing those parking units?
Well, the benefit, so for the Windward, there were fees that the city, system development charge fees, and the city did contribute to the development, the capital, toward the project, so that parking would be provided.
If it's okay, maybe if we could tackle that offline and stay to the presentation?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Just in the essence of time and.
Yeah, so that's option 2. And then option 3 is a list of, I'm not going to go over all of these, they're in the report. There are 15 parking changes, and a lot of it, as you can see here, is repealing mandates for certain classes of use or development. But really, I think the key issue, or kind of the key change here that would be the greatest imposition on the city, it would require the greatest amount of resources, is the last item, O here. And so what that means is that we would create a parking program for residents or for employers potentially within these areas where we've repealed or significantly reduced off-street parking requirements, so that the residents or the tenants in these areas would have dedicated parking. It would be through a permit program. A parking benefit district is what it's called here. And in the on-street parking spaces along the curb would be not reserved, but they would be prioritized for people who have a permit. You see this in urban areas all the time. And it's really the kind of the consequence or, outcomes that happen when, you're not requiring all of that parking on the site or off the street, where the city is not providing, public parking facilities like what we were just talking about. We're not providing public parking in numbers, that are sufficient to meet all of the demand. And, that may be the most efficient way to manage parking, but is it something that is really, appropriate for Lake Oswego? That's the policy issue that, the council and the commission will be considering when we dive into this. But, those are the three options. The other piece to option 3 is that we have, this requirement that I was discussing with option 2, parking repealed within the town centers, also applies to option 3. But with option 3, the radius is expanded to a half mile, where option 2, it's a quarter mile. Option 3, it's a half mile. And, just for reference or for scale, a quarter mile is, about 1,300 feet. So, our downtown blocks are about 300 feet wide and I think close to 400 feet long. That's kind of the dimension of them. So, 300 times 4 blocks, or a little bit more than 4 blocks. If you're walking up B Avenue and you walk 4 blocks, that's about a quarter mile. So then if you walk into the neighborhood, north, about 3 of those longer blocks, you're getting into a quarter mile. If you go, 6 of those blocks, then you're looking at more like a half mile. So that's what, these policy options do on the ground.
Do you think this will spur development before these rules become effective, or will it put a damper on development? Do you have a crystal ball?
Well, I don't because I don't know what, the pro formas and the lending requirements are saying about some of the projects that might be in the queue, because that's really the key is like,
You can't finance it.
yeah, I mean, even, I think those venture capitalists out there want to know that, you're not gonna have any parking? What? I'm not sure I want to do this. And that's the part that we don't know.
Thank you.
Where does TriMet fit into all of this? And are they going to be getting a substantial amount of money from the state in order to increase their fleet so that there's more than 2 buses coming in and out of the city?
Well, right now, TriMet is trying to dig out of COVID, and
That's what I heard.
yeah, they have cut back service. They have a real problem, as do a lot of employers, with workforce and trying to have, hire enough drivers to keep the system operating at the level that it's funded. And, the funding has waned too, because the ridership, is still down, although it's coming back, but slowly. TriMet is engaged in a process right now, a service plan that they do, normally they do every 2 or 3 years. And they're looking at curtailing some, lines. None of our lines are on the list of, those that they would be cutting in the near term. Although, we know that 36 is running even less frequently than it used to. 37 and 38 are also fewer buses during the day, but they're, still a little bit more than an hour apart. And then on the weekends, they're almost non-existent, I think, 37. 78 and 35 are in better shape. Those are running hourly. But, the service planning that TriMet was doing before COVID was aiming at increasing frequency for 35, getting it up to 20-minute frequencies. They were also looking at reconfiguring some of the lines on the west side of town so that we would have actually frequent service running down Boone's Ferry Road to Bridgeport on up to PCC and then out to Barber Transit Center, realigning what is currently 37 and making it cover more areas where people actually want to get on the bus. But all of that has really been put on hold until they get this kind of post-COVID worked out.
So just another quick comment. It seems like this is really geared for a large metropolitan area that already has the parking structures, that already has the parking in place to accommodate this mandate. But in cities such as Lake Oswego or Wetland or Oregon City, where you have the downtown corridor and it's buffered 2 blocks away by residential neighborhoods, my hat's off to you and the staff on trying to figure out how to make this work without totally alienating and firing up the neighborhoods and creating a revolt. And then getting the businesses to come in and try and, you know, set up shop here. Granted, it's a lot more attractive than downtown Portland is, but in safety and a lot of other incentives, but.
Yeah, well, we do have, and that's a really good, you know, well taken. And, you know, the last time the city studied downtown parking, I think was 2010. And then there was some planning work that followed from that didn't really, it didn't come to fruition. And they looked at parking utilization. What they found was that the city had plenty of parking down here, you know, for the uses that existed at the time. What they found was that there was a need to manage it better. And I don't know, you know, that may have included some, you know, time limits or some pricing, some different strategies that would have just managed it better. But it also called for, you know, a parking strategy. So like the way that we've been developing public parking garages or acquiring or, you know, acquiring spaces within private garages for the public to use, you know, it's been opportunistic. We've had good opportunities and they've, you know, they've benefited the community. You know, you look at the farmers market every Saturday and those parking garages are used, and we have this great reservoir, the supply of on-street parking, and it's used. And we've been able to redevelop and infill in the downtown with the supply of parking that we have. That study, I think, was looking at, you know, at the time the city was planning for redevelopment in foothills, the Windward block was not yet a thing. You know, the Iron Light building and some of the other developments that we've seen had not occurred yet, North Anchor. So, you know, this may prompt, you know, it may prompt us to go back and look at some of that work again and to, you know, think about a strategy going forward, because I agree with you, Vice Chair, that, you know, looking at all of this in a vacuum, this is really kind of like the tail wagging the dog. You know, you almost, you know, kind of like House Bill 2001. It was implementation, and now we're going, because the state has also required housing needs analysis, we're doing planning work around that. Well, these rules are implementation, and we haven't, you know, well, it's been some time since we've done the planning. So I think the community is going to expect, I think they're going to want us to go back and look at, you know, kind of our plan and how we're going to continue to grow with less parking required. I think we also want to look at some of the case studies and evidence, hopefully that's out there, that will, you know, clarify some of these questions around, well, how much parking will the market actually provide, you know, on its own? Because, you know, just because we don't require off-street parking doesn't mean that developers are not going to create parking for their tenants, for their residents. So I think that's information that we can bring to the public in a conversation, so that people are not just like asking, what is going on here?
There'll be a lot of mandates that we won't be able to have, but it doesn't preclude them from developers from having parking.
Right.
Okay.
Commissioner Buchanan.
Just a small comment. All the contractor developers I've ever worked with consistently gravitate towards the spots where they don't have to have parking, and they can cram more of a building onto that site. So I think that, you know, limiting parking in these areas where there's an opportunity to build, that's going to be something that developers gravitate towards, and that creates a higher tax base, for example. But you end up with burgeoning parking on the street, so, yeah.
Yeah, to that point, I keep thinking, you know, if Safeway ever decides to redevelop their store up there and this goes through, and all of a sudden now they take out half of their parking, and now half of the people are parking in the neighborhoods, you know, there might be a little bit of acceptance to that for a while, but it's gonna get old real quick. And it's gonna be a lot of plastic bags in people's yards and, yeah. Yeah. Oh, Commissioner Blake, can you turn your mic?
I feel they're mandating things that don't fit us.
Commissioner Buchanan?
I moved from a neighborhood like that in North Portland, and they were just tearing houses down left, right, and center, and building, you know, on a 5,000 square foot lot, 18 units, no parking, because some of the neighborhoods were within 500 feet of the max line, or 500 feet from buses that traveled every 10 or 15 minutes. So, anyway.
Well, we do have some, you know, good controls or planning requirements in the city that will, you know, prevent that from happening. So, I mean, in the downtown, we have planned for not high-rise, but mid-rise up to 60 feet. And the code provides for a transition, a step down in height as you approach the neighborhood. The height is reduced. And then within the neighborhood, you know, height and lot coverage and floor area and all of those dimensional requirements that we talked about during the middle housing discussion really, you know, limit how many, and then of course the zoning, we allow middle housing now. So, you know, that opportunity is there, you know, for a developer to build 4 units on, you know, 6,000 square foot lot and, you know, under these state rules, not provide any off-street parking. So I think that is a very realistic scenario. But I just don't think it's going to happen at the scale that, you know, Central City Portland, because of our zoning requirements they're scaled to this community. Yeah.
You can only put 3 units on a 6,000 square foot lot, just a clarification.
All right. Thanks, Eric. I'm glad we have you here for this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Although a 7,000 square foot lot, you're up to 4, right?
Different, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Director Siegel, thank you for the presentation. I don't want to cut you off if there's more to go and an update, but.
There really isn't any more. I mean, that's essentially it. And again, you know, December of this year, or actually the 1st of 2023, you know, the reduced mandates will go into effect. Again, that was, you know, bringing multifamily housing parking requirement down to 1 space per unit, not requiring any off-street parking for the housing that is less than 750 square feet in size, not requiring off-street parking for affordable housing and those other childcare and those other uses that were listed. You know, that's the first level, and then the other changes, we will need to do some work together with the Planning Commission and the community to answer those, you know, answer the questions about what these requirements mean and how we're going to implement them. Here's the timeline for us. And the transportation plan update is not something, as I'm understanding it, it's not required directly by the rules, although that timeframe 2024, 2025, there may be updates to our plan that are required as a result of Metro updating the regional transportation plan, and that's when we would expect to see that. So thanks. That concludes my presentation, and glad to answer any other questions that you might have. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, any other questions for Dr. Siegel?
You had given this presentation to council, and did you say they were sort of in favor of option 2 unofficially, or what?
They wanted us to investigate that, all of, you know, the options 2 and 3 more closely, but option 2 seemed to be the one that they felt would be the most viable. excuse me, mainly because it didn't involve, creating a parking district or taxing or, a permit program for people to park.
Questions? Okay. Are you looking for feedback from the commission on the process and the plan going forward?
Well, I'd welcome any input that you have. And, again, this was really meant to be an update. I realize it was probably more than that because there was a lot of content, but, any feedback's really welcome. The next time we discuss this, the next time we work on this will be probably in the fall. So that's when the city council asks that we come back in like November or December, once the state has sort of fleshed out some of the questions that we have, that worked out some of the kinks.
Okay. Yeah, I think probably until that point, it would probably be prudent for us to just keep this in the file and dust it off. But going forward through on the schedule that we'll review here next, be prepared for when the council does pull the trigger and identify which path to go forward to dive into it.
Thank you. We will be preparing information about just the scope of this and having it available online, and making sure that people are going to have questions about this, and we need to be able to kind of lay out a roadmap for how we're approaching it. So.
That might be beneficial for the legislatures or the governor, who might have their own questions on what they just did.
I will defer to the voters on that.
Is there any other new business?
There's just one thing that I've been asked to ask of you. We are still in need of a planning commission representative on the Lake Oswego, so it's actually the Neighborhood Coalition of Lake Oswego, which is the insurance entity, basically, that the city sort of sponsors for neighborhood associations, to help, essentially cover any liability that could occur from their meetings, more or less. So it's a requirement that they meet once a year, and we typically do have a planning commission representative, so just wanted to see if there are any volunteers. The meeting is on Wednesday, by the way, so it's coming up pretty quick here. We did try to ask before, so I'm just following up. Oh, what time is the meeting on? I believe it's on at 9:30 a.m. Iris, is that correct? 9 or 9:30. I think it's 9:30 though.
And it's likely they'll have a quorum in any event, right?
Right. Yeah. We just want to do our due diligence. So
I would have been happy to nominate Chair Hoop, who's not here, but he definitely won't be here for the Wednesday meeting either. So.
Right. Well, we thought we'd at least give it a shot. So. And yeah, Iris confirmed 9:30 a.m. on Wednesday is when we'll meet.
Appreciate the ask. I would definitely step forward and help out. This is actually my last commission meeting, so I won't be able to participate in that, but I would encourage any of the commissioners who do have the time to please help out with that. That's a very important piece for the city to work through. So with that, we can go on to schedule review.
Gladly, although we do have one other item of special business, other business, that I would like to, I'd like to present the vice chair, acting chair, with a distinguished service award for his service on the planning commission and a full term, more than a full term, too, right?
No,
Two,
I
one
would have done
yeah.
two if I would have been sticking around.
That's what I thought. Yeah. And anyway, signed by the mayor. Thank you for all of your service.
And thank you to all the staff, Iris, especially you, sincerely. And Eric, coming on, what is this, year 2, 3?
Yeah, we're into year 3 now.
Yeah, year 3. Okay, appreciate that. And Evan, I know that you didn't have much hair when I started this, but if you had any, you probably pulled it out because of me. And I appreciate that. And Director Siegel, too, helping shepherd it through and figuring out, like, getting my feet dry and not keeping them wet. So and all the fellow commissioners, especially Chair Heap, who have dedicated and taken the time to help the city. So I encourage all those others out there that have time to please step forward, because it is really important and it's fun work. It's a lot of work, but it's good fun work. So thank you.
Schedule review? Okay,
You have the floor.
thank you. Commissioner, your next regularly scheduled meeting is July 11th. You'll have a work session, a second work session on review of the non-conforming development criteria. And so we'll have a staff memo with some updated information and context and background, which is what you had requested. That'll go out ahead of your next meeting. The next meeting after that, the 25th of July, is a work session on exactions for ministerial development. And this is a follow-on or follow-up task to the work you did on middle housing. And I believe we've briefed the commission on this. So those are your next two meetings. Currently, we were showing two work sessions this summer on and into the fall on the climate-friendly and equitable community rules that we were just discussing. And based on the feedback from the commission and the council, we're going to propose that those work sessions not be removed from where we're showing them. If they're showing on your forecast, I think they were showing on August 8th and the 10th. So those will just slide out, later in the year.
Okay.
Okay. Which leaves one business item on the 8th of August, which is the annual Community Development Code amendments. And I believe we'll have two new commissioners taking their seats on the 11th, so I wanted to mention that as well. So I don't know if anyone has any other updates or any questions? All right, thank you.
And then I believe we'd be then holding the elections for the chair and vice chair on the 11th. Is that correct?
That's right. Thanks. I knew there was something else. That's why I was hesitating. Like elections, that's on the 11th as well. And so far, I think nominations were for, I'm trying to remember, Commissioner Leak, right? And Commissioner Stewart nominated. Yeah. So if there are any other nominations for chair and vice chair, just let me or Iris know, and we'll make sure that we're prepared for the next meeting. Thanks.
Great, thank you. If there isn't anything else, the meeting is adjourned.